What is the scariest noise you've ever heard? In my early 20s, I worked at a nuclear power plant in the laundry department, and there was an alarm for a nuclear event while I was on shift. All non-essential personnel had to take shelter in the on-site bunker and wait for hours. The speakers blared an alarm and notice inside and out of the complex. The notice was something akin to alert. Nuclear event in progress. Take your stations. Alert. Hours. I stayed up till like 3 AM and just heard a super loud scream outside of my house. It wasn't just one time though. It happened a few times a week. Turns out it was a drunk dude. Still scared the crap out of me. Holy crap, and I got scared by 2 cats going at it. That emergency alert sound when it takes over your TV. Even though 99% of the time for me it's just bean tests, that sound terrifies me. I was shot at once, and the sound of a bullet passing close by is pretty distinctive, but I didn't realize what had happened until later, so I wasn't actually frightened by it. The most terrified I've been from a sound was when I was working graveyard security at an old army fort converted into a school. Part of the job was to walk through the buildings every hour or so and check the doors that are supposed to be locked. During one check I stopped midway to use the bathroom, and while I was washing my hands I heard a sound partway between a moan and roar. That was exactly the sound you'd expect some shambling undead monstrosity to make, and it came from right outside the bathroom door. I stood there frozen in terror for a good 5 minutes, still holding a paper towel. When I didn't hear any other sounds, I turned the lights off to get accustomed to the dark, slowly opened the door, and sprinted for the exit. I didn't go in another building the rest of the night. 2 days later I was back for a day shift on the weekend. I'd had some time to consider what had happened, so I went back to the same bathroom and flushed the toilet. A minute later, the old water pipes made the same noise again. The roar of a tornado that was about 1/8 of a mile from me combined with the sound of the emergency sirens and the fierce winds full of all kinds of debris. The wet thunking sound of my grandmother's head hitting the pavement when she fell off a walker, followed by low moaning and a pool of blood. She ended up being okay, but at the time, I thought I just watched her die in front of me. Woman howling in distress after her very young son had died due to a sudden and unexpected illness. Me and the nurses ran towards thinking someone had been seriously injured. We found her completely broken and took her somewhere for privacy until her brother could arrive. Girl getting her hip popped back into place in the air with no meds after being thrown 100 feet off a motorcycle. I will remember the scream forever. It seriously haunts me. Dislocated joints are one of the better things ERs deal with. They can solve that and the patient gets better pretty soon afterward. Aortic aneurysms, though, the patients are awake, they're in horrible pain, and half of them don't survive. The sound on its own wasn't actually scary. It was the fact that it came from the middle of my room, in the dark, and it sounded like a person making a popping sound with their lips. I was trying to convince myself that I imagined it. Then I tried to make the same sound, to see if I could. I did, and then I heard it again, like an answer. Yeah, 10-year-old me was scared shitless by that. I still have no idea what that was or where it came from. Giving me Hereditary vibes. The sound of the death rattle when my grandmother was on hospice in her final hours. It's a sound you're never prepared to hear even when you know death is coming for your loved one. Yep, I was there for my mom's last breath. Terribly sad moment. The National Weather Service announcements on TV radio. The aggressive beeps followed by the muffled and staticky voices horrifying. One time at 3 AM my big dog let out a full-on wolf howl in a dark room. He was dreaming. I've never heard him howl, before or since. It was a full volume. It grew about a foot from my face while I was asleep. I seriously thought I was in mortal danger. I was walking my dog at about 4 AM a couple of years ago. I go to work before the crack of dawn, and heard a coyote howl in my neighbor's backyard. Then another one answered it, from the other side of the street. My dog literally stopped and crap in the middle of the street, then turned and headed back to the house. I almost crap, too. Dang, that blew up. Thanks for the award. The thunk of a car hitting my sister and the noise she made as she hit the pavement. Truly the most pants-crapping level of terror I've experienced, and that's a deep well to draw from. She survived after resuscitation. Don't drive drunk. Way back in the 1980s when I was in the Navy, my ship was down at the Guantanamo Naval Base for training. One day we were out at sea doing underway replenishments alongside an aircraft carrier. During this exercise the two ships would sail side by side on the same course, very close together, and rigs lines and hoses between the two ships to transfer fuel and other supplies. It's some dangerous crap. Every time our two ships would come together and get lines passed to the other ship, a Russian trawler would come diddy-bopping along right between the two ships, forcing us due to an emergency breakaway. This happened repeatedly all morning. At lunchtime both ships took a break. The aircraft carrier also launched 4 F-14s. After lunch we started up again, got lines and hoses passed, and once again the Russian trawler came up between us. Once again we did another emergency breakaway, but this time, the 4 F-14s came roaring out of the clouds, one after another. Afterburners fired up, and all 4 went supersonic just over the trawler. I am insufficiently eloquent to convey to you what it sounded like. The roar of the F-14's engines, flying at maybe 80 featuring and no more than 25 yards away, was like the gates of heck had opened up and every tortured soul howled in anguish at the same time. In the midst of this horrific screaming were 4 thunderous booms, one after the other. It sounded like the world was coming apart. It was mayhem. The guys on the carrier knew this was coming. The guys on our ship did not. People screamed and dove for cover. People pee themselves. Some shat themselves. I nearly dove overboard looking for some cover from the god-awful noise. The trawler turned and disappeared over the horizon behind us at flank speed, and we never saw him again. If that trawler tries that again, we're gonna drop Thor's hammer on their head. My friend was fatally shot in the chest when we were leaving a club together in 2016. We were drunk and didn't really realize what happened, but when the reality of the situation set in, the look of fear in her eyes is an image I'll never be able to forget. She started frantically grabbing at her heart and crying, "I don't want to die," in between gurgled breaths. Moments before she passed, she started convulsing and making these primordial sounding squelching noises that haunt me in my sleep to this day. She was 21. I miss her every day. The sound of someone breathing, drowning in their own body fluids is one I do not wish anyone to hear, especially when it's their loved ones. My own face being beaten in by a home invasion robbery with the butt end of a gun. I woke up to being beat almost to death. It was so loud in my head. Frick man, hope you're doing better now. When I was a teenager I heard my dad screaming, "Wake up, stay alive," over and over while my mum had passed out and puked blood from a ruptured stomach ulcer. I'll never forget the pain in his voice. My grandmother had an epileptic seizure, and in the 2 seconds leading up to her collapsing she screamed. It was a scream that sounded like she'd just witnessed the most horrible thing in the world. I've forgotten exactly why she screamed, but a doctor said it was just like an involuntary reaction. Still scary as heck. It's the noise that happens when the seizure starts. All the muscles tense and air is squeezed out of the lungs and past the vocal cords. My husband's epileptic and 90% of the time makes this noise. It still catches me off guard. I live in a 150-year-old farmhouse and I heard the most maniacal child's laugh in the middle of the night, approximately 2 AM. I am 99% sure it was my 5-year-old daughter sleep talking, but after hearing that and finding her sound asleep was unsettling. My daughter wakes up in the middle of the night and has conversations with her stuffed animals. It can be super creepy to wake up to kid giggles for some reason. I occasionally get auditory hallucinations when I'm falling asleep. Falling asleep last night I heard what sounded like someone pounding on my door. Freaked me out, but our dog wasn't barking, which let me know it wasn't real. Have this happen every so often. One time it was a female voice screaming, "Get the frick out of my bed." Have experienced hallucinations a lot in the past, so knew what it was, but dang, they do wake you right back up again. An approaching earthquake. I was in the Seattle for both the Maury Island and Nisqually quakes, 1995 and 2001, respectively. Both sounded like a distant freight train barreling down on us at top speed, just this deep, low growl that shifted into a roar coming through the ground. Mid-roar was when the shaking started. The Maury Island quake was short and shallow. The Nisqually quake, I was in the Sodo district of Seattle, and I remember that after the worst of the shaking stopped, the ground was still moving like a liquid. That was uncanny, but that sound, it's like nothing else. I rented a cabin in the middle of nowhere outside of Breckenridge, CO on vacation. It was about a 30-minute drive into town, so it was not close to anything really. On our last night, starting at about 2 AM, there was a consistent, very loud bang that I can only imagine was a gunshot that sounded like it was directly outside the house. Not like someone hunting in the distance, but someone shooting very, very close. The scary part was the direction the sound came from, and distance would rotate and seem to change distance that someone on foot couldn't do. It usually takes a lot for me to get spooked, but I was freaking terrified. If something were to happen where I was, that would be it. It continued on until early morning and I got no sleep. I checked the property for footprints the next day and there was nothing. To this day, the only logical explanation I can think of was that it was gunshots very far away, but because of the acoustics of the mountain and valley, it just seemed close. No idea what it was though, but I'll remember it forever. I was at the Belmont Naval stop in Chicago, waiting for my train to go to work. On the opposite platform, a very drunk man, what used to be called a wino, fell onto the tracks. Several people on the platform reached out to him, trying to pull him back up. Every time the drunk man tried to stand up, he fell right down again. The people on the platform couldn't reach him. My own train arrived and I boarded, then continued watching this drama unfold through my window. Suddenly the commuters on the opposite platform started screaming, louder than I've ever heard anyone scream before. The sound was horrible. I could feel it in my chest and in my stomach. People were frantically pointing, and I turned to see what they were pointing at. Just then a train barreled into my field of view. The drunk man hadn't been pulled up yet and I realized that there wasn't enough time left. The train was traveling too fast. One of the would-be rescuers was leaning quite far over the edge of the platform, with his upper body directly in the path of the oncoming train. They say that you never know how you're going to react to a situation until you actually experience it. I wouldn't have thought I would react this way, but my hands, almost as if they were acting on their own, raised up and covered my eyes. I didn't want to see whatever carnage was about to take place. I didn't want those memories to exist in my head. After a few seconds I heard the sound of the other train screeching to a halt. I lowered my hands. Through the windows of the other train I could see that the drunk man was now standing on the platform, unharmed. During those brief seconds when my eyes had been closed, the people had succeeded in pulling him to safety. Everybody lived. It's true, and it's really nothing to judge. Our subconscious brain makes snap decisions for us most of the time in crisis, and we are just along for the ride. When my father held in place a stack of pallets, I don't know what they are called in English, but they are these wooden squares to place boxes or similar things on top. It must have been more than 45 pallets that were about to crush it. He used his arms and torso, managing to stop all that weight and putting it in place. I remember his pallet is, indeed, the correct English word. Was helping my dad fix an old water heater in a house he was looking to flip. As we were messing with pipes, we heard the sound of gas escaping. Scrambled out of the house ASAP. Turns out the gas shut off the house used was faulty and we hadn't properly shut it down. The moment we heard the noise was terrifying though, since natural gas can blow so easily. I live on the edge of a small rural town, so it's not uncommon to encounter animals here, but many of them are still too spooked to venture in from the wilds this far. One night, I was just watching some movie in the living room. The doors and windows were open, and I heard a woman scream. It was high-pitched, blood-curdling. I ran outside with my rifle, trying not to look as frightened as I was, and there I saw nothing, just the tree line in the darkness. I looked around for a while and went back inside, starting to question whether or not I heard it at all. 5 minutes later I hear it again and run back outside. I forgot to grab my rifle this time though and was cursing myself as I approached the tree line again. But this time, I saw who made it. A goddamn owl. It looked at me, floofed up its feathers and made the same sound. Owls typically don't want much to do with people, but on the rare occasional I've seen one in town, it's been the hoo kind. This bad boy sounded like a poor woman getting necked by a slasher. I felt pretty relieved. Pretty dumb too. Lightning struck a tree behind my house. I was by a window on the side of the house facing it, and it sounded like a huge bomb went off, knocked stuff off shelves and scared the heck out of the cats. I was shaking from adrenaline for a long while after that. Once I was leaving my friend's house after a big barbecue party, backing up my car very slowly, keeping a close eye on all the children running around the yard. My husband, who had arrived in a different vehicle, and so wasn't in the car with me, thought it would be funny to walk up beside window and slap the glass. I was looking over my shoulder at that moment and didn't see him coming. For one horrible second I thought the noise of the slap was the sound of me running over a toddler. I slammed on the brake and started screaming before I realized what had happened. The terror was so strong that even though it only lasted a second, I couldn't stop crying for like 10 minutes. My husband felt real bad. Oh, man. I did something similar to my girlfriend once. She was not happy. Scratching in my walls late at night and slight hissing sounds. I lived on my own and I was so scared. I recorded to show people I wasn't hallucinating. I would only hear it from about midnight to about 4 AM. Called the landlord and found out some possums were nesting in that wall. Cat starting to vomit on a new sofa at 3 AM. Those sounds just before it happens are truly terrifying. Probably scares them too. My daughter choking when she was 18 months old. She pulled her hair clip out and inhaled it. We were in the middle of the supermarket at the time and she was in the trolley. I turned for 7 seconds to get a loaf of bread. My buddy had his child fall off the changing table onto the floor, turned to get a diaper and took his hand off of her for a couple of seconds. Happened that fast. He had changed her hundreds of times. She ended up with a broken leg. Freaked him out. I've heard some stuff to scare me, like being in the woods at night and bearing coyotes around me like surround sound. The worst happened this past Sunday. I took my daughter to a park that has some hiking trails and at the end was going to let her play on the playground equipment. As we are finishing on the final mile-long trail I kept hearing noises of some kids throwing rocks into a dry creek bed but didn't see them. As we came to an incline with some exposed roots I asked her to hold my hand to help give her some stability. Just as she moved forward and grabbed my hand I heard the sound of a rock hitting the trail about 2 feet behind us, and as I looked back saw what was probably a 5 or 6 pound rock bounding into the brush to the right of us. I looked up to make sure nothing else was coming and sped up. I yelled something along the lines of whatever stupid fricks were throwing rocks. They were landing on a trail and nearly hit someone. Had the rock hit my daughter or myself in the head it would have killed her and either killed or really hurt me, and then my 3-year-old would be alone hoping someone else came along on the trail. Once we got to the playground at the end of the trail I called the rangers and told them what happened. Within 5 minutes of me calling, a ranger was at the 2 exits to the trail. This seriously pisses me off. Possible break-in attempt. My bed placement put my head right on the other side of the wall where the guy attempted to kick our door in, and then a single pair of heavy footsteps running away. He may have heard me react to the slamming on the door, leading him to run. We know it wasn't a prank because a week prior, we were ding-dong ditched and the kids were caught by the police. Plus we don't have many kids in the neighborhood. The last breath of a human being. We were on a walking path and this guy passed us on a bicycle, but he looked pretty exhausted from the heat. 20 feet ahead of us he fell over and we ran to help him up. He was unconscious and just gave out this one big last shudder and stopped breathing. That was probably 40 years ago, but it still haunts me. It was the epitome of casting off this mortal coil. People underestimate the danger of overexertion. One night as I was falling asleep I heard a woman scream bloody murder. It sounded like it came from the parking lot outside my window of my apartment. I was so scared someone was being attacked or something, but I just couldn't bring myself to check outside. So I just tried to listen for anything else. A car door, footsteps, a voice, anything to verify I should maybe call the police. After what felt like an eternity, it was probably more like 10 minutes, I heard nothing at all. I finally checked the window and saw nothing suspicious. I thought I must have imagined it, but I was so sure it was real. Eventually I must have fallen asleep. The next morning I told my roommate what happened and asked if he heard anything. He started laughing. Turns out, His girlfriend at the time stayed over that night, and she has a history of night terrors. He explained that last night she had a night terror and screamed. He told me he was wondering if someone might have heard and called the police, so he stayed up half expecting them to show up. I told him I guess I was the only one who heard, but I thought it was funny that it sounded like it came from outside the apartment, not inside. It's a good laugh now, but that night I was frozen with terror. I was on my way to my barber when I heard screeching tires, and I looked to my left to see tire smoke in the opposite lane, followed by the sound of an accident. Apparently a car in the oncoming lane lost control, jumped the median, and crashed head-on with a car behind me. Let's say my pants felt a little heavier because I drive a Mini Cooper. The echo of rainwater hitting the floor of a sewer drain just flashes me back to being 6 years old and sneak watching it from behind the couch when Pennywise met Georgie. I forgot there was an old it for a second and thought, wow, a 9-year-old, unless you are actually 9. At my work, a little girl was messing around unsupervised on the escalator and her coat got stuck and she was dragged under the railing. She was pinned under there, and I've never heard a more horrifying scream in my life. It started out as loud AF, but it just got inhuman. The poor girl was terrified, and it took over an hour to get her free. There was a pillow right next to her and she was sort of wedged between. Luckily she only had some minor bruises with no serious damage, but I imagine she had a tough time afterwards. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.